While the U.S. Army was steadily conquering territory under President Aguinaldo's jurisdiction, another campaign against him, even more ferocious, was being waged, not with a bullet and a sword, but with the power of words and the pen. American newspapers and publishers, and its army of writers, did what they could to discredit Aguinaldo in order to justify the ongoing war against him and the First Philippine Republic. Among them was the American war correspondent Murat Halstead, an ardent supporter of President McKinley and author of the candidly titled Aguinaldo, a traitor to the Filipinos and a conspirator against the United States. Mr. Halstead, who dishonestly described Generalissimo Aguinaldo as a man who never saw a battle, also stated in his critique that this impostor himself, that is, Aguinaldo, entered our lines with nothing but a staff of 13 adventurers, whose distinction was that of having been bribed by the Spaniards. The so-called bribe that Mr. Halstead was referring to was the 400,000 Mexican pesos that the Spanish government under Gobernador General Fernando Primo de Rivera actually paid to Aguinaldo as part of a provisional peace treaty signed in December of 1897. This treaty, more commonly known as the Pact of Biak-Na-Bato, generally stipulated that in exchange for Aguinaldo's exile abroad and the temporary secession of the Filipino War for Independence, the Spanish agreed to implement reforms and pay Aguinaldo 800,000 Mexican pesos. The Spaniards did not actually pay the entire 800,000 pesos as agreed, but the controversy here is not the amount paid, but that Aguinaldo would accept money in the first place. High-ranking American officials, as will be proven with the evidence to be presented, knew very well that Aguinaldo did not accept the payment for personal gain, and that he did in fact use the money to purchase much-needed arms and ammunition for the Philippine Revolution. Yet, while the American government of occupation was quick to censor and fine Filipino writers and newspapers, like Fidel Reyes of El Renacimiento, it did not censor with the same vigor American newspapers and writers, like Mr. Halstead, who distorted information related to the 400,000 pesos Aguinaldo received. To be perfectly honest though, there is a possibility that Aguinaldo himself contributed to the prevailing perception of him being a corrupt leader who sold himself and his country for money. In more recent times, a controversial statement re-emerged said to be by Aguinaldo, praising the Spanish monarchy and repudiating Andres Bonifacio, the father of the Philippine Revolution and the Katipunan, or the KKK, which was an organization that sought independence from Spain. The statement in question was recorded in a Spanish newspaper by Jose Barroso after the signing of the Pact of Biak-Na-Bato, and it included these now infamous lines. I ask you to tell our beloved Queen, His Majesty King Alfonso XIII, the government of Señor Sagasta, Spain, and the entire world of our loyalty to Spain, our unconditional adherence to the royal family, the government, and laws of our fatherland. We took the field not because we wished for separation from the mother country, but because we were tired of bearing the material and moral burden of that arch, the keystone of which in our country is the friar. It is quite true that the Katipunan instilled in us another desire, that of independence. But that desire was unattainable, and moreover, it was in opposition to our sentiments. It served as the banner of Andres Bonifacio, a cruel man whom I ordered shot, and with his death, the Katipunan disappeared. This quote has led many to believe that the accusation by Aguinaldo's critics, like Halstead, was in fact true, that he did sell out the independence movement spearheaded by Andres Bonifacio. Considering that Aguinaldo has been misquoted a number of times in the past, and erroneously accredited with orders and statements that other Filipino officials made, as was seen earlier in Part 1, I could attempt to deny that this statement was made. But for the time being, I will simply assume that Aguinaldo did make the controversial statement recorded by Jose Barroso. Does that mean, then, that Mr. Halstead was right all along? That Aguinaldo was a traitor who sold himself and friends to the Spaniards and accepted silver for honor? The evidence, as you will see, suggests otherwise. Aguinaldo is often misunderstood because his words did not always align with his actions. When we look at the months prior to the Philippine-American War, for example, he publicly professed friendship with and admiration for the Americans. All the while, as we saw in the previous section of this lecture, he was secretly stocking up on arms, ordering trenches to be built, and instructing General Pantaleon Garcia on January 21, 1899, "Tell the Filipino soldiers in the walled city affiliated to our cause that they must keep on good terms with the Americans in order to deceive them, and prevent their confining them, since the hoped-for moment has not yet arrived." We can infer from his dealings with the Americans that Aguinaldo had almost no compunction, in other words, no problem, over working with or flattering his enemies if it served a greater good and the real goal was not sacrificed. With that in mind, it is very reasonable to conclude that when Aguinaldo allegedly made the statement recorded by Jose Barroso that he was attempting to disassociate himself from the independence movement started by Bonifacio and convince the Spanish that he no longer had any intention to take up arms again, in order to get the Spanish to make the payments needed to continue funding the Philippine Revolution. If Aguinaldo were to be judged based on his actions rather than on his words, it is abundantly clear that abandoning the fight for independence from Spain was the last thing Aguinaldo intended to do. No one would have known this better than the Americans, including Halstead, since correspondence, testimony, and reports directly related to and associated with the Pact of Biak-Na-Bato can be found in the official records of the 55th, 56th, and 57th U.S. Congress. From a dispatch of U.S. Consul General Rounceville Wildman from Hong Kong on November 3, 1897, to Assistant Secretary of State William Day, which can be found in document number 62, Part 2 of the 55th U.S. Congress, we can see that only a month before the signing of the Pact of Biak-Na-Bato, when negotiations were still taking place for the supposed surrender of the Filipino revolutionaries, Aguinaldo was simultaneously working to form an alliance with the United States and to secure additional arms from the Americans. Consul General Wildman's aforementioned dispatch to Washington, D.C. substantiates this, as he describes to the U.S. State Department his interactions with Aguinaldo's representative, El Embajador, or Ambassador, Felipe Agoncillo. Sir, since my arrival in Hong Kong, I have been called upon several times by Mr. F. Agoncillo, Foreign Agent and High Commissioner, etc., of the new Republic of the Philippines. Mr. Agoncillo holds a commission signed by the President, that is, Aguinaldo. Mr. Agoncillo offers on behalf of his government alliance offensive and defensive with the United States when the United States declares war on Spain, which, in Mr. Agoncillo's judgment, will be very soon. In the meantime, he wishes the United States to send to some port in the Philippines 20,000 stand of arms and 200,000 rounds of ammunition for the use of his government, to be paid for on the recognition of his government by the United States. Aguinaldo and Agoncillo's efforts to secure arms on credit from the U.S. in November of 1897 fell through, as the offer of an alliance and the plea for arms was declined by Thomas Cridler, the third Assistant Secretary of State of the U.S. State Department. And this may have influenced Aguinaldo into accepting the Pact of Biak-Na-Bato a month later, because the money promised by the Spanish government was now the only viable route to obtaining the rifles and ammunition that the Filipino revolutionaries needed. What is additionally interesting about Consul General Wildman's dispatch is that it disproves the notion, suggested by some, that Aguinaldo's original motive was to use the 800,000 pesos for himself, and that the idea of purchasing arms for the revolution was a last-minute thought that only occurred to him after America already declared war on Spain in April of 1898. That war would erupt between Spain and the U.S. was no sudden surprise to Aguinaldo or Agoncillo, as shown in Wildman's 1897 dispatch. Nor was the thought of purchasing arms a new idea in 1898. Cynics may ask themselves, if Aguinaldo really did intend to purchase arms, why wait? Why is it that he waited until the Spanish-American War to order the weapons? And why did he not purchase arms immediately after signing the Pact of Biak-Na-Bato? There are two major reasons why the purchase order for weapons was stalled. First, according to the Pact of Biak-Na-Bato, the Spanish agreed to make payments in installments. The immediate purchase of arms would have violated the pact, and the Spaniards would have had every legal right not to make any payment and pursue a legal claim for payments already made to Aguinaldo. Second, according to the official records of the exiled Comité Central Filipino, or the Central Filipino Committee in Hong Kong, the 400,000 pesos transferred from De Rivera to Aguinaldo could not be withdrawn in whole or in large portions without prior approval of the bank directors, and even then, only a fraction of the original 400,000 could be withdrawn every 3 months. The translated minutes of the Comité Central Filipino, dated May 5, 1898, which can be found in the official records of the 56th U.S. Congress, under communications between the executive departments of the government and Aguinaldo, sheds light on the limitations the banks imposed on Aguinaldo's ability to withdraw the money from Biak-Na-Bato, which was deposited in the Chartered Bank of India, Australia, and China, and the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. It reads in part, he, that is, Aguinaldo, was not able to draw out all the funds in spite of the need for them, because the directors of the said banks objected to it. $200,000 are on time deposit in the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, and the other $200,000 are in the Chartered Bank, under the condition that he can draw from that sum $50,000 every 3 months. Contrary to popular belief, Aguinaldo could not simply withdraw the 400,000 pesos whenever he pleased, either to divide among his friends for a personal shopping spree, as his critics always like to insinuate, or, in this case, to purchase arms immediately upon exile. Eventually, Aguinaldo did manage to purchase the arms he had been trying to obtain since 1897. We know this because Oscar Williams, the U.S. Consul General at Manila, on May 24, 1898, wrote to now Secretary of State William Day, informing him of the assistance he rendered to Aguinaldo to purchase arms from the money deposited in Hong Kong. This correspondence can be found in the congressional record containing the proceedings and debates of the 57th Congress, and in it, Consul General Williams reports in part, Sir, at a conference with General Aguinaldo, the head of the movement, I was told that they had now above 4,500 Mauser rifles taken from the Spaniards, and had also abundant ammunition. Until the present, they have been fatally crippled in these respects. Today, I executed a power of attorney, whereby General Aguinaldo releases to his attorneys in fact 400,000 now in bank in Hong Kong, so that money therefrom can pay for 3,000 stand of arms bought there and expected here tomorrow. With all the evidence presented, proving that Aguinaldo had not abandoned the revolution's goal of independence from Spain, further analysis about the controversy surrounding Biak-Na-Bato could be terminated at this point, and Aguinaldo would still be exonerated of charges of bribery and corruption. Nevertheless, no discussion of Biak-Na-Bato would be complete without mentioning what American newspapers and writers intentionally omitted from their articles about him during their later campaign to portray him as a traitor and a money-hungry tyrant during the subsequent Philippine-American War. It is vital for Filipinos to realize that our image of Aguinaldo today as a corrupt sellout is a part of the lingering legacies of the American occupation, and that this image was not coincidental, that is, a product of insufficient research. It was a likeness, purposely sculpted by those who manipulated information to produce a revolting profile of the man who stood in the way of American occupation of the Philippines. To demonstrate this deception, we will go back to Mr. Halstead and his work, Aguinaldo, a traitor to the Filipinos and a conspirator against the United States. He referenced various American officials and officers to support his contention that Aguinaldo was nothing more than a self-serving opportunist whose only accomplishment was being bribed by the Spanish. But as you will see, Mr. Halstead cherry-picked information from sources like Consul General Wildman and General Charles Whittier to support his narrative, but often left out or downplayed information from these sources that were favorable to Aguinaldo or which contradicted his own views. For instance, Mr. Halstead specifically quotes from correspondence dated July 18, 1898, which was exchanged between Consul General Rounceville Wildman and the U.S. State Department, but conveniently left out the portion of the dispatch which is the most relevant to the money from the Pact of Biak-Na-Bato. Consul General Wildman's 1898 dispatch can be found in the Congressional Record of the 55th U.S. Congress, and the portion of Wildman's report that was omitted by Mr. Halstead reads as follows. There has been a systematic attempt to blacken the name of Aguinaldo and his cabinet on account of the questionable terms of their surrender to Spanish forces a year ago this month. It has been said that they sold their country for gold, but this has been conclusively disproved, not only by their own statements, but by the speech of the late Governor General Rivera in the Spanish Senate, June 11, 1898. He said that Aguinaldo undertook to submit if the Spanish government would give a certain sum to the widows and orphans of the insurgents. He then admits that only a tenth part of this sum was ever given to Aguinaldo, and that the other promises made he did not find it expedient to keep. In another example, Mr. Halstead actually included pertinent information in Aguinaldo's defense. In this case, from General Whittier's testimony before the 1898 U.S. Peace Commission, who negotiated the Treaty of Paris. Yet, while he quoted Whittier, Mr. Halstead failed to elaborate on the most relevant portion of the general's testimony, so much so that he might as well have left it out and not bothered quoting it at all. The part referred to stated that Aguinaldo went to Cavite under the permission of Admiral Dewey in reply to a telegram sent by Spencer Pratt, Esquire, our Consul General at Singapore, who offered that chief, that is Aguinaldo, money for his expenses. The offer was declined. This excerpt of General Whittier's testimony was treated by Mr. Halstead as though it were insignificant and irrelevant, but if he had not been blinded by his bias against Aguinaldo and had taken the time to assess and address the general's statement carefully, it would have become rather apparent to him that his characterization of Aguinaldo is nowhere near the rapacious vulture he made him out to be. If Aguinaldo was primarily driven by money and profit, as Mr. Halstead asserts, why turn down free money? More importantly, why turn down the opportunity to milk the Americans dry? Had Aguinaldo been truly greedy, he would have seen this as the perfect opportunity to take advantage of his position and alliance with the U.S. Aguinaldo could have inflated his expenses and have the Americans pay for it while pocketing the excesses, but he did not even entertain the thought. He declined Consul General Pratt's offer at the outset, and with that, the opportunity to line his pockets. It would not be an exaggeration to say that an entire book could be written disproving the numerous false claims made in Aguinaldo, a traitor to the Filipinos, but it is not necessary to do so. Just these two examples alone are more than enough to demonstrate that Mr. Halstead intentionally omitted or glossed over relevant and significant portions of documents and testimonies he utilized when his own sources undermined his views. However, there is just one last claim by Mr. Halstead that needs to be addressed, because the serious nature of this additional accusation warrants further attention. In addition to bribery, which has already been disproven, Mr. Halstead made an additional accusation that Aguinaldo made a payment during his exile, which he described as blackmail. Here is an excerpt of that allegation. Anyone familiar with the Spanish policy in the colonies will find in the detail of the incident of the indemnity to Aguinaldo, that is the 400,000 pesos, a typical case of old-fashioned bribery in the High Castilian form. There was no doubt about the case at all. Aguinaldo confessed that, when he paid $5,000 to Atarche blackmail, in preference to having the suit that was brought against him for a share in the money aired in the Hong Kong courts. Before debunking this allegation, it should be clarified that there was no such person by the name of Atarche, as Mr. Halstead claimed, who sued Aguinaldo in Hong Kong. The individual who he was likely referring to was Isabelo Artacho, who served briefly as Aguinaldo's Secretary of the Interior when Aguinaldo's headquarters was still located in Biak-Na-Bato. While it is true that Artacho sued Aguinaldo in Hong Kong, and that Aguinaldo did pay Artacho to settle out of court, this was in no way an admission of guilt for either bribery or blackmail, nor was it an attempt to keep Artacho silent, as Mr. Halstead insinuated. There was far more to the story than Mr. Halstead, as usual, left out. Aguinaldo suspected Artacho of being a spy for the Spanish, and believed that he was attempting to sabotage the revolution from within by depriving it of the funds obtained from Biak-Na-Bato through his lawsuit. He voiced his concerns about Artacho to the other exiled revolutionaries, and the Filipinos in Hong Kong concluded on February 24, 1898, as can be found in the translated minutes published among the records of the 56th U.S. Congress. On no account will the principal or the 400,000 be withdrawn except for the common good. They will accept the resignation by Senor Isabelo Artacho of his charge as Secretary of the Interior. And as for the sum which he asked for, it will not be paid without consultation with Senores Pedro A. Paterno and Baldomero Aguinaldo to find out whether Senor Artacho received anything from the Spanish government on account of the peace. Aguinaldo intended to comply with the Filipino Committee in Hong Kong in not paying Artacho, even going so far as to giving up the leadership of this committee and going into a self-imposed exile to Singapore, just to avoid Artacho's lawsuit in Hong Kong. Nevertheless, by the time the Spanish-American War commenced, Artacho's lawsuit had not been withdrawn, and he successfully obtained a writ of attachment for the funds held at the Chartered Bank and the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. Essentially, what this meant was that the money was frozen at the banks, and as mentioned earlier, the bank directors objected to the withdrawal of the entire 400,000 pesos. Artacho's lawsuit and the writ of attachment continued to remain a major obstacle to purchasing arms, even as Aguinaldo's return to the Philippines was imminent. The minutes of the exiled revolutionaries for May 5, 1898, which can also be found among the records of the 56th U.S. Congress, reflected the financial dilemma the revolutionaries faced on account of Artacho's treacherous actions. The suspension of the payment of the funds must be agreed to and reckoned with as short as compared with the delay caused by the suit which Don Isabelo Artacho has entered against the President, as shown. Today, they are the object of a suit whose end cannot be seen. In consequence, no good will arise for the country by waiting for the time when we can dispose of these funds, while the problems which confront the Filipinos today require immediate solution. Thus, when Aguinaldo finally agreed to pay Artacho, it had absolutely nothing to do with blackmail, motivated by a desire to keep Artacho silent. Aguinaldo did not have to fear Artacho accusing him of accepting a bribe and improperly handling the funds while in exile, because all he needed as proof was the bank's refusal to release the 400,000 in its entirety, while the writ of attachment was in force. Simply stated, Aguinaldo could not squander the funds even if he wanted to. After all, how could Aguinaldo spend money which he could not touch? But it is rather obvious that he had no such intentions. If he did, he would have simply divided the money with Artacho as soon as he arrived in Hong Kong and lived a comfortable life abroad. This would have saved Aguinaldo the headache of a lawsuit and a second exile to Singapore. From the minutes of the Comité Central Filipino in Hong Kong, it is clear that the impediment Artacho's lawsuit and attachment caused to continuing the revolution was a far greater factor in deciding to settle out of court with him. Surprisingly, this conclusion was even supported by one of Mr. Halstead's sources, U.S. Major General Francis V. Green. This Spanish-American War veteran was by no means a fan of Aguinaldo. In fact, General Green underestimated Aguinaldo's capabilities and his support among the Filipinos in the Philippines. Nonetheless, he at least gave Aguinaldo some credit and even wrote in his defense regarding the Artacho affair. From August of 1898, General Green reported in his memoranda concerning the situation in the Philippines. Aguinaldo and his associates went to Hong Kong and Singapore. A portion of the money, 400,000, was deposited in banks at Hong Kong, and a lawsuit soon arose between Aguinaldo and one of his subordinate chiefs named Artacho, which is interesting on account of the very honorable position taken by Aguinaldo. Artacho sued for a division of the money among the insurgents according to rank. Aguinaldo claimed that the money was a trust fund and was to remain on deposit until it was seen whether the Spaniards would carry out their promised reforms. And, if they failed to do so, it was to be used to defray the expenses of a new insurrection. The suit was settled out of court by paying Artacho 5,000. No steps have been taken to introduce the reforms. More than 2,000 insurgents, who had been deported to Fernando Po and other places, are still in confinement, and Aguinaldo is now using the money to carry on the operations of the present insurrection. General Green's report on the Artacho affair completely contradicts everything Mr. Halstead accused Aguinaldo of, whether bribery or blackmail. Interestingly, only a year earlier, in 1898, before publishing Aguinaldo a traitor to the Filipinos, Mr. Halstead published General Green's statement on the Artacho affair in his The Story of the Philippines, and even called General Green's report a memorandum for the general information that is the most thorough and complete ever made, and is the latest and highest authority on all the subjects to which it relates. Fast forward a year later, to 1899, when Aguinaldo was now America's enemy, Mr. Halstead, like many other American writers of his time, suddenly forgot what General Green had to say in Aguinaldo's defense. Yet, he could not claim that he had amnesia as an excuse, because when he wrote Aguinaldo a traitor to the Filipinos, he specifically quoted from a treaty of peace between the United States and Spain multiple times, which included General Green's memoranda and his defense of Aguinaldo in the Artacho lawsuit and settlement. Therefore, we can conclude that his demonization of Aguinaldo and false allegations of bribery and blackmail were done so with malice, intending to mislead the general public about the true nature and purpose of the pact. More could be said about the anti-Aguinaldo smear campaign. Mr. Halstead, after all, was not alone in deceptively portraying the Pact of Biak-Na-Bato as nothing more than a bribe cloaked in diplomacy. Other American writers and newspapers during the Philippine-American War would likewise twist the truth to win public support for the war effort against President Aguinaldo and the First Philippine Republic. However, the presentation of any further evidence would be redundant, for it should be evident at this point that Aguinaldo did not consider or accept the money from the Pact of Biak-Na-Bato as a bribe. It was accepted with the understanding that it was always intended to purchase arms and ammunition for the Philippine Revolution. If any fault could be found against Aguinaldo in this particular controversy, it is that he publicly praised his enemy and repudiated Gat Andres Bonifacio. On the other hand, if Aguinaldo had said nothing, or, if he stated that despite their differences, he would use the 800,000 pesos to continue the revolution Bonifacio started? Would Spain have paid what they promised at Biak-Na-Bato? De Rivera could not even be trusted to pay the entire 800,000 pesos, even after all of Aguinaldo's flattery and attempts to distance himself from the revolution. Thus, it is unlikely that the Spanish would have paid even a single centavo had Aguinaldo not said what he was quoted as saying to Jose Barroso. And had that occurred, the arms and ammunition, which would later play a critical role in the defeat of the Spanish army, would not have made it into the hands of the patriots who used it to liberate the Philippines from Spain. Rather than treason, the Pact of Biak-Na-Bato should be celebrated today as the move that would result in the Filipinos putting their Spanish opponent in check after the stalemate of 1897. Se había convenido entre todos nosotros los revolucionarios en Biak-Na-Bato que en el caso de no cumplir los españoles lo estipulado, el dinero procedente de la indemnización no se repartiría y se destinaría a comprar armas para reanudar la guerra. El Generalísimo Emilio Aguinaldo, 1899.